In addition to clinging to the laws, customs, and practices of this province, the colonists were concerned about the safety and security of the people.
Concerned about the safety and the security of which people? The slave owners and others who would come to be known as white people, right? We're reading from the book White Over Black by Dr. Winthrop D. Jordan. And so when people are oppressed, just like how the Negro slaves were, then there's always this potential for a counteraction against that oppression. And this could manifest in the form of violence, right? Which these colonists, they clearly understood and they had reason to be concerned.
Fear of Negro slave rebellion, expressed as early as 1672 in Virginia, was ever present in the West Indies, the plantation colonies on the continent, and even, with less good reason, in some areas in the North. In many areas, it was a gnawing, gut-wringing fear, intermittently heightened by undeniable instances of servile discontent. Every planter knew that the fundamental purpose of the slave laws was prevention and deterrence of slave insurrection.
Every slave planter who were the owners of the slave plantations, they knew that the laws were rigged in their favor. And this is to make sure that there was minimal chance and opportunity for the slaves to rise up against their authority.
In pleading for a strengthening law in 1710, Governor Alexander Spotswood reminded the Virginia Assembly that constant vigilance was the price of continued mastery.
This is the governor we're talking about right here. He let them know that the price that they must pay to remain a master was a constantly keeping an eye out or being watchful or keeping their eyes and ears to those plantation streets, right? And so here's what the governor wrote right here.
And the trials of last April court may show that we are not to depend on either their stupidity or that babble of languages among them. Freedom wears a cap which can, without a tongue, call together all those who long to shake of the fetters of slavery.
Freedom can call together those who desire to remove themselves from the realm of slavery, right? That's who they were primarily concerned with, right? The coming together of the slaves who actually desired freedom, right? Because everyone didn't desire it, and everyone still today doesn't desire it.
And as such, an insurrection would surely be attended with most dreadful consequences, so I think we cannot be too early in providing against it, both by putting ourselves in a better posture of defense, and by making a law to prevent the consultations of those Negroes.
By using the tool of the law to rig the game and by having the power to enforce it, right? That's one of the ways that they would defend against the consultation of those Negroes. And who are those Negroes? The Negroes who had a desire not to be slaves anymore, right? They weren't worried about the ones who wanted to stay slaves because those people, they just fall in order, right? They fall in order with the goals of the colonists. The colonists were worried about the ones who wanted freedom, right? Which was against the goals of the colonists. And so there were only a few of them then and still only a few today, right? And so the final phase of freedom today is a complete removal of the Negro or the black way of thinking, right? That was learned during that time.
Whenever slaves offered violent resistance to the authority of white persons, the reaction was likely to be swift and often vicious even by 18th century standards.
They handled the problem right away to maintain in the minds of the people that those with a pinkish orange skin called white people held a position of authority. And what would happen to those people with a brown skin who were called black people if they tried to compromise or go against that authority.
The bodies of offenders were sometimes hanged in chains, or the severed head impaled upon a pole in some public place as a gruesome reminder to all passerbys that black hands must never be raised against white.
That's the psychological impression that the colonists intended to make. And it's something that you'll also see today a lot of cartel members doing in Central and South America, where they will hang the heads of their rivals on the freeway, right? And this is for all the people to pass by to see. And so these are symbols, and they're symbols that are meant to speak and deliver a very powerful message to the unconscious mind. And the unconscious mind is the desired point of contact for those that are in the know.
Until 1722, slaveholders in South Carolina were required, under penalty of the law, to have any of their female slaves running away for the fourth time severely whipped, branded on the left cheek with the letter R, and her left ear cut off.
The branding of the R, which stands for rogue, is also what was done to the European servant. But the Negro girl, she was whipped on top of that and also had her left ear cut off, right? And so again, this is a symbol, and it's a symbol that's intended to make her easily identifiable to any person that would walk past and see her.
In that colony in 1732, a man named Charles Jones met resistance from a runaway Negro and killed him on the spot. Jones thereupon dutifully went to inform a justice of the peace of what he had done and was instructed to cut off the Negro's head and stick it up on a pole at the crossroads.
More terrorist types of activities from these people, right? And the government was also sponsoring it. And so this is how they aided in destroying the mindset of the slaves, right? And creating what is called a black inferiority consciousness. And so it was these and many other types of terrorist attacks that help mold that particular type of consciousness.
The owner of this now useless piece of property was of course entitled to compensation from the public treasury.
And it's easier to see why people were able to commit these types of acts on other humans, because they believed the slaves to be real pieces of property, right? They believed that.
The degree to which slaves actually offered violent resistance to slavery has been the subject of considerable controversy. In the West Indies, there were fairly frequent outbreaks, though they are hard to filter out from the steady flow of human violence in the islands.
The West Indies had frequent outbreaks because they only had a relatively small white population to deal with, right? And the slaves outnumbered the whites in many instances, which made it way easier for them to resist.
On the American continent, it now seems clear that there were many more rumors than revolts, and that the number of actual revolts was small.
On the American continent is where you had the most violent, vicious, and the most ruthless English colonizers, right? They settled here. And so the English colonizers who settled here, they were no joke, right? And on top of that, they outnumbered the slaves that were in America, right? Which is the opposite situation of that in the West Indies. And so one could understand how the number of revolts would be small.
If it takes a score of persons to make a revolt, the number all told before 1860 was probably not more than a dozen.
A score is a group of 20, which is what the author is considering as a revolt. And so there was only a baby number of revolts in America.
On the other hand, resistance on a small scale was common and widespread, demonstrably so.
Resistance, I'm assuming he means a smaller number or individuals trying to break free from the chains. And so this was much more common.
With some justification, the colonists were unsettled by recurring instances of masters, mistresses, overseers, even whole families murdered by their slaves, variously strangled, clubbed, stabbed, burned, shot, or most commonly the colonists felt poisoned.
Some of them, they had enough, right? And they released their anger and they released their frustration out through one of the only outlets that they knew how to, right? Which was killing upwards of everyone in the whole house by any means necessary.
Some of these instances might perhaps be properly regarded as ordinary crimes, yet it is impossible to separate slave crime from resistance to slavery. Slashing an overseer with an axe might stem from blind rage or a disordered mind, but it scarcely represented acquiescence in the role of slave. At very least, there can be no question that the colonists had considerable justification for regarding their slaves as dangerous. Presumably, the principal reason for the colonists' fear of slave insurrections was a pardonable distaste for having their throats cut. Nearly universally, Negro conspiracies were regarded, and perhaps there was some real basis for the view, as aiming not only at freedom, but Negro mastery.
The colonists thought that Negro freedom meant breaking out of those chains and then putting them in those same chains.
Slave conspirators were often said to have plotted taking over the entire locality for themselves and to have intended utter extirpation of most or all white people. The colonists seem incapable of envisaging a Negro revolt which would end with the blacks gaining freedom and nothing more. A successful insurrection loomed as total destruction as the irretrievable loss of all that white men had won in America, which, of course, was America itself.
And that's why they were terrified of the Negro Rebellion, because they believed blacks would do unto the whites as the whites had done unto them. And because of that, they tried everything possible to keep the Negro remaining as a Negro, right? By keeping their minds in the sunken place and in the depths of the dark pit, where the light is dim and the way to escape is largely unknown. And so I want to thank you for watching all the way until the end. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.